Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this teach-in organized by students supporting UMFA. We want to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba, where many of us work and study, is located on Treaty 1 territory in the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations, who are the first and rightful inhabitants of these lands. The water that sustains us here comes from Shoal Lake. As the first university to be established on what is now called Western Canada, we recognize that the university's historical and ongoing role to enable violence and oppression that Indigenous people have suffered and continue to suffer. It is through the university's ongoing and growing relationship with the neoliberal state and global capitalism, that colonization and violence against Indigenous people are inseparable from the academic institution that is now called the University of Manitoba. Today, we have an amazing guest speaker, Adele Perry, who will be joining us to discuss commemoration and social movements and the connection between the strike and support of it to the recent challenges to conventional colonial commemoration. Dr. Perry is a settler historian of colonialism in 19th and 20th century North America and an intersectional feminist. She has taught at the University of Manitoba since 2000 and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a past president of the Canadian Historical Association. Dr. Perry is also the director of the Center of Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Welcome, Professor Perry.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank students supporting UMFA, students supporting the strike for this opportunity, for this invitation, which is a real honor to be kind of a small part of what is both kind of a pretty epic series of sort of speakers. And I think also just a very small part of some really creative and powerful and effective and mindful and in many respects, awesome interventions that students have made in and around this ongoing strike that the University of Manitoba Faculty Association is engaged with. I think I speak for many, if not all of my colleagues, when I say how incredibly heartening it has been for us to see this visible support and to feel it and to learn from it. And we're grateful, and I'm really honored to be a small part of it. So I'll just kind of to sort of expand a little bit on what Olivia kind of said by way of introduction. Adele Perry Nidishnakas, Gawin Nijudimsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganash Kwe Minda. My name's Adele Perry. I don't know my clan, and I live in Winnipeg, and I'm a white woman. And I've worked here on Treaty 1 territories for a little over 20 years, which is kind of shocking. And I've always, been honored to be a guest here and to work in a range of ways to both honor those relationships with Treaty 1, also of the Manitoba Act, which Riel and some of his contemporaries refer to as the Métis Treaty, and also via the water I drink, my relationship with Treaty 3. So I am a historian of colonialism in the 19th and 20th century, and I'm not really a student of commemoration. And historians and kind of scholars of kind of history-ish things draw a distinction between history, defined as sort of the study of social and ecological and all manner of other changes over time, and commemoration, which we see as kind of a more kind of formal practice of commemorating and drawing a certain kind of honorable attention to certain things in the past. And there are lots of people who study commemoration as a practice, and I'm not really one of them. But for a range of ways, I think thinking about commemoration and commemorative practices provides a really useful and effective window for teaching, and also just for thinking a little bit about the relationship between the past and the present, and also in the future, in the worlds that we live in, and also the worlds that we are trying to bring into being, whether through formal and informal action. And I've been thinking about this a little bit more because I have been on picket duty at the Manitoba legislature for the last little while. We don't all need to go into how long it's been. It's been longer than we might have wanted. So I'm there every day from, well, usually in the mornings. Today was really cold, a little bit different. When originally we talked about this, we thought we could do it in person, and we do a little bit of a walk and talk, which is one of the things that I like to do. But Olivia said, no, we decided to do it all on Zoom. And I was like, really? That's too bad because the weather's still nice. But now it's a week later, and I'm so grateful for that decision. But it's made me think a little bit about the space of the Manitoba legislature as both a seat of kind of political colonial power in all of its authority and violence, and also as a space of commemoration, where there is both the kind of commemorative practices and objects that we might conventionally expect to find around a legislature, but it's also been sort of the site of a range of challenges to those commemorative practices in Indigenous-led social movements over the last year. And so kind of what I want to do today, and I hope this all works, and maybe it won't, but you'll all be kind to me if it doesn't, is try and think a little bit about all of these things in combination and build on what Drs. Sinclair and Parent brought to the table in the first teach-in, where they really kind of put questions of Indigenous faculty and the recruitment and retention thereof of Indigenous students, and kind of decolonization more generally at the center rather than the margins of what we are working for as both faculty members, as librarians, as other UMFA members, and students and community members who might support, and putting those issues at the center rather than at the margins of the issue. And also build further on what Dr. Julia Smith engaged when she brought these questions of where strikes fit in histories of labor struggles, but also more generally in social change. I'm going to see if I can kind of pull all of this together. And I want to start with this one image, which is an image that I took week before last of UMFA picketers picketing at the Manitoba legislature, which is obviously a gesture to call the province out for its clear involvement within this particular set of negotiations and their ongoing failures, but also an attempt to engage the obviously kind of political character of what is at stake here. And the fact that we are doing so within a context of not just of kind of obvious sort of stately state power, but in very clear evidence of the way it has been kind of contested. And this contestation is made visible by the plinth, which I'm not even sure if I say right. Maybe somebody can correct me. That's one of those words that I've only ever read and never heard said. The kind of platform upon which a statue sits, which was formerly where the statue of Queen Victoria had sat there since 1904. And that statue has been remade by a series of events that began on the 1st of July of this year and have continued, where people have drawn attention and found kind of creative and very kind of meaningful ways to render visible the connections between both Manitoba and Winnipeg as a space of colonial violence and ongoing Indigenous presence, connections with colonial past and presence, particularly around residential schooling, and connections with that with commemoration, including of folks like Queen Victoria, who I'm calling a folk there just for fun. So I think this is a powerful remaking, and it's one that kind of puts into play all of these different moments, these different histories, suggests how they are connected, and I think also suggests how maybe they could be more connected. So all of this draws on a very long history of, in particular, Indigenous critique of Canadian commemorative practices that venerate the Canadian state and its histories. And these are long-standing practices. We can see them in moments like the 1967 performance of Chief Dan George, also the grandfather of the recently departed Lee Miracle, may she rest in peace and in power, when he offered his lament for Confederation in 1967. We see this again around Canada 150, which in the lead up to that, many of us who were kind of committed to kind of critical views of Canada and its history were gritting our teeth, prepared for some pretty difficult moments of having to live through a kind of uncritical celebration of a settler colonial government and its histories. And I think what we saw instead was the really enormous kind of power and impact of Indigenous scholars, artists, activists, and others who really kind of situated a critical view of those histories at the center of Canada in 150. And one image that I like most of all of this was one that was done by a couple of our historian colleagues at Guelph University, led by Kim Anderson, Brittany Luby, and Leanne Letty, where they remade the Fathers of Confederation image into the Grannies of Confederation Christmas card, and wished us all a happy holidays and much merriment as Canada 150 came to an end. We can also see this in just kind of everyday commemorative and alternative commemorations, including around the Colonialism 150 t-shirt that's at the top there. And there was lots of other ones too, but all of these show us ways in which Indigenous scholars and activists and their allies kind of provided a really kind of forceful intervention into what had been planned as kind of an uncritical kind of commemoration of Canada and its history. In the particular context of Manitoba, this is played out, I think, in sort of interesting ways and in ways that we might need to kind of watch in the years that follow. Manitoba's 150 normally would have come about a year ago, and it was kind of in the worst parts of what was and continues to be a brutal global pandemic, and particularly so within the context of Manitoba. And in that context, how we might commemorate and contest the history of Manitoba's government and its relationship to Canada and its relationship to Indigenous nations and sovereignties has kind of been postponed, both sort of formally and informally. And I think one of the things that I look forward to in the next year or so is seeing some things, including an exhibit that's going to be organized at the Winnipeg Art Gallery by our former colleague, Dr. Sherry Farrell-Rissett of the University of Regina, Kathy Mallett of the University of Winnipeg, and some others, that uses the Michif word for a hard birth, like a difficult labor. And for some reason, it's a word I can never remember, but it will hopefully be launched in the spring. And we can sort of see that as kind of a moment where we might get some of those critical conversations that were kind of bracketed and postponed in the sort of some of the most difficult days of what was a very difficult second and third wave in the province of Manitoba. Manitoba is the only province that entered Canada in blood and a moment of conflict. And we tend to kind of paper over that history, both by kind of focusing on aspects of the history of Red River Métis resistance and the leadership of Louis Riel that focus on certain aspects of a history and not on others, and more generally in kind of a milquetoast friendly kind of Manitoba stuff. But I'm hoping that we can get back to some of these ways of thinking about this place's very long history of resistance, and particularly Indigenous resistance to Canada. But Winnipeg and Manitoba has been sort of the site of many of these kind of commemorative histories that folks have tracked elsewhere. The image on the right, the larger one there, is, you can see there when Queen Victoria's statue was first put up in 1904, and that was the former part legislative buildings. That you can see the one that we currently have being built behind it there. And what we can sort of get a reminder here is that these commemorative practices tell us not really about the history that they invoke. They tell us about that history in kind of an incidental sort of way, but what they really tell us about is the moment that they are developed, funded, argued for, petitioned for, and created. And in other words, commemoration reveals not so much about the history itself, though it may reveal some things about that. It reveals about the moment that it was, that commemorative practice was imagined and called for. And we can see Queen Victoria in particular being kind of installed as a certain icon within the kind of context of Manitoba at the end, after her life, after her rule, and where we can sort of see the development of a certain kind of ongoing way of kind of folding in those aspects of the British Empire within kind of a settler colonial commemoration. But it's also tied to other aspects of commemorating that state in those ways. And on the other image I have there is another statue. Some of you may be familiar of. It's been moved, like many of these statues that I'm going to talk about today. It's currently just outside of the Manitoba Museum. And it is a monument to, quote unquote, the volunteers, who were the soldiers on the Canadian government who went in 1885 to put down the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. And my understanding is that is one of the sort of commemorative pieces that the current Welcoming Winnipeg Committee is looking to alter. And it is interesting that it has not come under sort of the same kind of optics of scrutiny and conversation, but it is certainly one way that we can see some of the most unequivocally violent aspects of Canadian colonial government, its relationship to Indigenous nations and territories in and around this place, commemorated and celebrated within the landscape of the city. And we can also see this in commemorative practices around Indigenous leaders, and especially Louis Riel. The image that you will probably be familiar with, located at the Manitoba Legislature. And if we were down there today, we'd be walking around behind the legislature to the Assiniboine River right now, but we're not. We're imagining what that might be, which is good because it's kind of cold out there. That was a statue that was unveiled in 1996, and it was one that was argued for, funded, and arranged in part out of critiques of Métis communities, in particular the Manitoba Métis Federation, regarding the statue that had been there before, and that is the one that is there on the left. And you might have seen that one at the Collège de Saint-Boniface, at the University of Saint-Boniface. And that was one that was produced in 1973, and it was moved from the ledge to the college in 1995. And we can see this very highly gendered, highly embodied kind of representation of Riel as kind of a vulnerable, literally naked man, depicted in ways that very much go against the way that Riel is very much represented as sort of a statesman, as he is in the latter statue. So we can see here these kind of practices of commemoration, the way that they're changed, the way statues are moved, the way people get involved, the way all of these things shift, just telling us a lot about how folks in Manitoba sort of see themselves and their relationship to the histories of this place. Another statue that you might have noticed, and if we were walking, we'd be walking back around the front of the legislature now to Guest to Memorial, right across from Great West Life, is one of the other representations of female figures other than Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth until they were put in the river this summer. And that is a statue that was produced in 2010 of the quote unquote famous five, a group of five white first wave feminist activists that did critical legal work around having the definition of who counted as a person changed within the British North America Act. And this very much represents, I think, both the power and to some extent the limitations of second wave feminism arguing for the inclusion of women within these sorts of kind of political iconography. What there is not within this kind of pretty broad ranging kind of list of things commemorated at the Manitoba Legislature is anything that commemorates a First Nations person. This has been raised for some time, and in the wake of things that happened this summer, the province announced that they were putting money to build a monument to recognize Anishinaabe Chief Peguis in the Selkirk Treaty of 1817. So this is yet another thing where we might watch this space to see how and if it may change in the years or in the year to come. So many of us here, I was there, I think a couple of other people who are on this call were there, were part of, in one way or another, the Every Child Matters walks that were organized for July 1, Canada Day this year, across the country, and in particular within the city of Winnipeg. And like many kind of big marches and moments, I think these things are often very powerful events for the individuals who take part in them. Maybe this one most of all because where it fit within the pandemic and what this has always meant for our own relationships to public space, to being with others, and to trying to create change. And it was at this moment that the Queen Victoria statue was remade. The statue was removed itself, along with one other one, and it was recreated as kind of a, I would guess I characterize as an art exhibit, as a kind of an act of commemoration of a radically different vision of Canada. One that situated histories of genocide against Indigenous peoples, especially associated with residential schooling at the center of that history. And I just put up here as well the Google questions that came up when I was looking for something, which was sort of an interesting assortment of things that people might ask among these questions. What statue got pulled down in Winnipeg? Why was Queen Victoria's statue toppled in Winnipeg, Canada? Where was Queen Victoria's statue pulled? And when was the Queen in Winnipeg? Also a good question to ask. And also in interesting ways that these questions really register the ways that some of these debates and these conversations actually focus all sorts of attention on these histories and these commemorative practices that otherwise they're just kind of built into the everyday of a lot of people's lives. And we might have passed that statue by many times, not thinking about it as a copy of an Anglo-Indian statue that kind of tells us a little bit about the circulation of all of the stuff within the broader empire, or as a commemorative kind of practice and a moment and an object that could be remade in the powerful ways that it was on July 1st. And this, I think, brings us to some of the questions that I sort of started with, and that is a little bit about how we commemorate social change, how we think about finding ways to remember some of the things that we have done and lived through over these last years, and that we are continuing to do and live through. And that would include moments, I think, like the strike and the work that students supporting the strike have done. And here I kind of want to connect these to the social movements that I think have really rocked this place in all sorts of ways in the last while. And those are Indigenous-led social movements that call us to think differently about Canada's past, but also differently about how we might live in these territories as both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and how we might envision that future. So I finish here with a couple of other images. One is of the Every Child Matters march walk that was held in Winnipeg on the first day for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And also an effort to commemorate a different moment of social change. And that is I don't want to call it a statue because that's kind of the wrong term. That is the monument that marks the history of Winnipeg's general strike in 1919. That commemorates a moment where a streetcar was tipped on Bloody Saturday. And I guess what I want us to think a little bit about here is how we might think about how we can remember these moments and how we can think about them to pass them down in ways for people that come after us, to remember them so we might use them to inform what we do and what we say and what we teach and what we learn. But also to think a little bit about how we might bring those questions of Indigenous scholars, of Indigenous students, of decolonization to the center of the work we are doing right now. The Winnipeg General Strike was a moment that brought together many people, but it didn't bring together everybody. And those patterns of exclusion and silence are important to talk about as well. And one of the things that I continue to do work on is how the histories that dispossessed the particular First Nation of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation on the Manitoba-Ontario border in the interests of securing water supply for the growing city of Winnipeg, and in particular for the working class North End, occurred at the same time and around at the exact same time with many of the same people, and was ultimately knit together in all sorts of ways. And those are sometimes ways and histories that we need to think of in complicated terms in order to render those connections more visible than they might be. And I guess I would urge us to think about ways that we might do that as well, regarding the social movements and the changes and the histories that we continue to be involved in. Whether we can seek ways to take those histories and those lived experiences regarding Indigenous scholars, Indigenous librarians, Indigenous professionals, regarding Indigenous students, regarding all students' access to the deep and enduring knowledges of these territories and its peoples, and how we might build movements that connect these in ways that are just and powerful and help build the worlds we want to see. So I think that's all I have to say. I don't know if that made any sense. There was a lot of moving parts, but we have some time, and I think we have ways of doing Q&A that Olivia will tell us. So I will turn things back over to Olivia.